Hey, everybody. So glad you're here with us tonight. Welcome. Glad to have you with us. Yeah, let's do it. Let's jump right into it.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. This stream is going to be a little bit different than some of the others because a lot's been going on, and I'll tell you more about it later. But just like on the other streams, I give my opening remarks. Then from there, we do the roll call. Then I answer your questions. We're only on YouTube tonight, YouTube and Facebook. So if you got something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, send a super chat here on YouTube. We'll go for a little bit. We're just going to do it for a little bit tonight. Opening remarks, roll call, and then answering your questions. Quick announcement, which is that morning messages, we have them on the CPI YouTube channel every morning. They are awesome. They are great. We got one queued up for tomorrow. So if you want to start your day with revolutionary hope and optimism, this is a great way to do so with the CPI morning messages. Make sure to subscribe to the CPI YouTube channel so that you can be part of that. You can get a morning message every day. They premiere at 6 a.m. And in addition to that, if you would like to make a morning message, right? We now have an open line for submissions. So if you would like to submit a morning message, give us your thoughts, send a message out to the community to start your day. You can also do it at this link. This is the link to submit a morning message. So we've got that. So as I said before, tonight, stream will follow the same format. Opening remarks, roll call, answering your super chat questions. So there we go. All right, so I'm just going to jump into it. So, folks, I got to just tell you, a lot has been going on lately, as you're aware. The whole situation with my Kamala Harris book continues. Got some big interviews coming up and all of that. Don't want to say too much about it because I've talked to you all about it endlessly. It's still for sale on Gumroad, and they haven't blocked it as of yet. So if you want a copy of it, just go to the link down below. Gumroad is the best way to get your hands on it. And a lot is happening. There's going to be a big announcement on Monday about a new effort that we're doing in relation to the book and CPI and all of that. Big announcement on Monday. But in light of that, I thought tonight would be a great time to just read from a book that certainly hasn't sold anywhere near as many copies as the Kamala one, but our new CPI textbook, Out of the Movement to the Masses. I wrote this book because I've spent my entire adult life researching communist groups and anti-imperialism and stuff. And I wrote this book to kind of compile all the information that I have and how it gives us an understanding and a basis for what it is that we're doing in our time. So tonight I'm going to do a reading from this book. I'm going to read you chapter 3 of this book. I'm not going to read you the original text that go with chapter 3. I'm just going to read you chapter 3, which is about the new communist movement of the 1970s. And if people have super chats as they come in, then I'll answer those in the second half of the show. I got a lot on my mind. I'm happy that thousands of people are reading this book that I wrote. I'm very proud of this book that I wrote, and I'm glad thousands of people are reading it. I'm also got a lot on my plate. I have anxiety about what various directions this could go in. Who knows what's coming up, but we're doing our best to make the most of this situation and do what's right and tell people what needs to be told. And so in light of that tonight, because I've got a lot on my mind, but I do want to engage with you, my audience, we're going to read chapter 3 of Out of the Movement to the Masses. So thanks for coming along. And we're going to read chapter 3. Then I'll answer your super chats. And then from there, I'll be saying good night. So, all right, chapter 3 of Out of the Movement to the Masses. It's on the new communist movement of the 1970s. All right. And if you have your own edition of the book, this is the CPI textbook, Out of the Movement to the Masses, Anti-Imperialist Organizing in America. If you have your own edition, this is page 223 that this starts, your own copy. And we'll just start reading it. And this is about the new communist movement of the 70s. As I read, I'll keep my eye on the chat because I want to see what people are saying, but I also have to be reading the text. So there we go. Many young Americans who grew up hating McCarthyism and Cold War conformity became involved in protesting for civil rights and against the Vietnam War, and eventually became communists. For some, the awakening came sooner than for others. From the late 1960s to the early 1980s, a wave of new Marxist-Leninist parties emerged, many of them aligned with China, and most of them with roots in the Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 faction of Students for a Democratic Society. This current is generally referred to as the new communist movement by academics. The various groups, which had very limited success throughout the 1970s as the divisions in the ruling class intensified. In a few places, most notably Detroit, the NCM had substantial influence over the population and within local government. The organizations played a role in some rather explosive events to close out the decade. But after Reagan's victory in the 1980 election, they began to fade in relevance and dissolve. The NCM, or the New Communist Movement, is worth studying because unlike the left that remained after its demise, these organizations had a more mass orientation. They sought to be the party of the American people in their millions, often specifically aiming to recruit industrial workers. The NCM's failure was due to a number of conditions working against them. The labor aristocracy was still pretty solidly intact, and the bulk of the white working class rejected class struggle politics. China, the country from which they sought ideological guidance, was shifting its politics very rapidly and aligning with the United States. There were also a few fundamental errors in approach that were widespread and worth discussing. Overall, the new communist movement should be studied and revisited because many of the, quote, lessons of that period, absorbed by the current leadership of the various Marxist-Leninist sects, are incorrect and need to be unlearned. A new perspective on the politics of the era and its successes and failures is worth exploring. So this is the first section here, From Emmett Till to the Black Panthers. The New Left that first worked to support Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and end legal segregation, and then later mobilized pacifist marches for de-escalation and negotiation in Vietnam, was not a grassroots phenomenon. It developed because of big disagreements within the ruling class, springing from the wave of anti-imperialist uprisings around the world, the question about how the Black community should be handled, and the huge importance of military spending in stabilizing the post-World War II U.S. economy. From 1946 to 1971, the world experienced the greatest wave of economic growth in human history, referred to by economists as the post-World War II economic expansion. The USA had the highest standard of living in the world. Industrial workers could afford comfortable suburban homes with a working husband, often without even a high school diploma, supporting a wife and 2 or 3 children. At first, the ruling class had swung in a right-wing direction, crushing the Communist Party, weakening organized labor with the Taft-Hartley Law. But soon, McCarthyite fanaticism turned into a vehicle with which Bonapartist and middle-class elements could threaten some of the wealthiest capitalists. Meanwhile, the treatment of African Americans had long been something communists had rallied against, and many in the ruling class felt it needed to be properly addressed or adjusted. The roots of the New Left began with the lynching of Emmett Till in August of 1955. The 14-year-old black teenager from Chicago had been visiting relatives in Mississippi. He was accused of whistling at a white woman in a local store owned by a white family. That night, the store owner and his sons abducted Emmett Till from his home and tortured him to death. Similar vigilante killings by whites to enforce the racist structure of the South happened all the time. At Emmett Till's funeral in Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, arranged for an open casket to show how brutally her 14-year-old son had been killed and mutilated. She explained her decision, saying, quote, "There was just no way I could describe what was in that box. No way. And I just wanted the world to see." Photographs of Emmett Till's corpse, taken by Jet Magazine and the Chicago Defender, generated a huge amount of outrage. And as the news spread, many Northern politicians called for the murderers of Emmett Till to be prosecuted. In a 5-day trial in September, the killers of Till were found not guilty by an all-white jury, prompting outrage and protests around the country. The following year, 2 killers of Emmett Till, Roy Bryant and John William Millam, published their account of how they murdered Till in Look magazine, saying they felt it was necessary to keep the local black population, quote, in their place. Millam said, "I just decided it was time a few people got put on notice. As long as I live, I can never do anything about it. And N-words are going to stay in their place. N-words ain't going to vote where I live. If they did, they'd control the government. They ain't going to go to school with my kids. And when an N-word gets close to mentioning sex with a white woman, he's tired of living. I'm likely to kill him." The Soviet Union sent the image of Till's mutilated body, which is in the book, but I won't show it because I don't want to, I don't want to get this channel taken down. But Google the image of Emmett Till if you want to see it. The Soviet Union sent the image of Till's mutilated body across the world, and it accompanied William L. Patterson's document, "We Charge Genocide," published a few years prior as presented by the USSR at the United Nations. In response to Till's killing and the Soviet Union's publicization of it, the Kennedy family and many Northern liberals organized vigils and protest marches in urban centers against racism and Jim Crow. Then, in December of 1955, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., with financial support from the United Auto Workers Union, launched the Montgomery bus boycott, demanding that the bus lines in Montgomery, Alabama, drop their policy of requiring black people to ride in the back of the bus and give up their seats for whites. Rosa Parks was quoted in national media explaining why she refused to sit in the back of the bus, saying, quote, "I thought of Emmett Till and I just couldn't go back." The black community refused to ride local bus lines. The Montgomery bus boycott ended on December 20th, 1956, after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation laws on Alabama buses violated the U.S. Constitution. It was a victory that pushed the civil rights movement forward. Martin Luther King Jr. was chosen to lead the boycott because he was old enough he was young enough to have not been associated with the Communist Party in any way. All the older black ministers who were willing to oppose Jim Crow segregation had some connections with the communists, as they were among the only anti-racists in the South. The Communist Party's Civil Rights Congress provided lawyers and support to black people facing the death penalty in Jim Crow courts. And the Soviet officials frequently condemned the United States for treatment of African Americans. Right? King became the public face of a new upsurge of protests throughout the country called the Civil Rights Movement, using the term civil rights, which the Communist Party had coined in the late 1940s as its buzz phrase for pro-black activism. However, the Communist Party was largely unwelcome in what was a well-funded and well-publicized mobilization paid for by liberals. Funding from the United Auto Workers Union and the Institute for Policy Studies and the Rockefeller Foundations and the Ford Foundation enabled young Americans, black and white, to attend, quote, freedom schools and get trained in the art of civil disobedience. The philosophy they were taught was Gandhian pacifism and Protestant Christianity. The young protesters believed they were helping make the U.S. true to its democratic ideals and subjecting themselves to persecution and martyrdom while turning the other cheek in a Christ-like way. The freedom schools were known for their atmosphere of repetitive singing, chanting, and clapping. This is an image of the freedom schools. All right, it says there, I'm trying to read it here in the end. It says, young activists who worked with the civil rights movement were trained in freedom schools that taught civil disobedience, Protestant Christianity, and Gandhian pacifism. Mainstream media showed the police brutalizing young white radicals, which created a great deal of sympathy for ending legal segregation on a national level. Liberal TV hosts like Lester Crane and Edward R. Murrow lampooned McCarthyist conservatives and shamed Mississippi and Alabama for their apartheid-like conditions. Basically, a wing of the U.S. ruling class had decided that racism was hurting the interests of U.S. imperialism and was willing to help mobilize youth in order to oppose it. This created an opening for genuine radicals. John Steele, a young civil rights activist who had been involved in the 1964 Freedom Summer in Mississippi and eventually became a communist, recalled, quote, "What swept me into civil rights in the civil rights struggle was in large the utter moral clarity of what was involved, the clear evil of institutionalized white supremacy, and the courage and nobility represented by the movement which was going directly up against it." Year after year, during the late 1950s and early 60s, college-aged radicals joined African Americans in getting arrested at lunch counters and bus stations, enduring police batons, and calling for an end to legal segregation. In 1963, the University of California at Berkeley banned students from organizing on campus for, quote, off-campus issues. This meant those recruiting for the civil rights movement and organizing boycotts of local businesses in California that opposed civil rights were forbidden from doing so on campus. Opposition to these restrictions led to a student uprising called the Free Speech Movement. On October 1st, 1964, students seized a police car after Jack Weinberg, a member of the Congress for Racial Equality, was arrested for setting up a civil rights table on the campus. During the uprising, 3,000 students surrounded the police car, putting a speaker's podium on top of it. The students held the car for 32 hours while giving speeches from the podium before the authorities agreed to drop the charges against Weinberg. The students later seized an academic building and hundreds were arrested, dragged out by the police one by one. And this is the famous photo of during the free speech movement. That's Mario Savio, and he's standing on top of the police car giving a speech, right? Because that's what they did. They seized a police car and they took turns giving speeches on top of it for the free speech movement. The leader of the free speech movement was Mario Savio, and his resounding words of "bodies upon the gears," declared on the steps of Sproul Hall before the students seized it on December 2nd, 1964, became an iconic expression of the sentiments of radical youth at the time. He said, famously, "There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all." Bob Avakian, a Berkeley student who joined the protests shortly after recovering from a life-threatening illness, recalled the civil disobedience arrests in his autobiography, From Ike to Mao. People were arrested in an almost assembly line fashion. As they were arrested, a lot of people were thrown down the stairs, and the women in particular were grabbed by their hair and thrown down the stairs. I was on the top floor, and I saw many people brutalized like that, and of course, this was only a few months after I had finally recovered from being sick. So besides being outraged generally, I was a little worried about what might happen to me if I got thrown down the stairs or otherwise brutalized, especially if I got hit in the area of my kidneys. And as my turn came to get busted, I recognized the cop who was arresting me as someone who had played basketball for a local college. I saw his nameplate said Gray. So I said, "Aren't you the Gray who played basketball for St. Mary's?" And I kind of shrugged my shoulders as if to say, "So what are you going to do?" And he replied, "Sorry, can't do nothing for you." And off I went. Of course, I was very happy to be arrested, to put it that way. I wanted to be part of this, and there was great camaraderie. When I did this thing with the cop Gray, I wasn't trying to not get arrested. I just wanted to not get thrown down the stairs or hit in my kidneys. But I was very happy to be part of this. Eventually, the university gave in and altered its policies to allow activism and political organizing among students. Soon, UC Berkeley and other prestigious campuses, including the Eastern Ivy League, became centers of, quote, the movement, with students engaging in civil rights activism and often challenging restrictions on their activities imposed by the college administration. Within the campus upsurge, the Communist Party USA and a few small Trotskyite groups were visible on the margins. The right-wing press made a big deal of their presence, and the paid organizers of the liberal organizations did their best to push communists into the background and denounce them. Progressive Labor Party was the most visible communist presence in the early 1960s, making a point of publicly speaking as communists as much as possible. The Progressive Labor Party, originally known as the Progressive Labor Movement and commonly just called PL, was a breakaway from the Communist Party led by Milton Rosen, a college professor from Buffalo, New York. The group denounced the Communist Party USA as revisionist, and it sold its newspaper Challenge around the country, defending Stalin against Khrushchev and pointing to China as the center of world revolution. Progressive Labor Party was present in the civil rights protests and other mobilizations of the early 60s, but was viewed as a group of fringe radicals. However, the organization began expanding rapidly as the political crisis intensified, having carved out its position as the most visible representative of communism in radical circles. Ramparts magazine sprung up in San Francisco Bay Area in 1962, originally as a publication aimed at promoting creative writing among Roman Catholics. However, after a few years, the publication became a vehicle for exposing CIA activities and promoting anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and pro-communist politics. Declassified documents show that the FBI strongly believed that the publication was funded by the Soviet Union or by China, or perhaps both, but they could never find substantial proof. The Bay Area magazine became an essential part of the political upsurge of the 1960s and the subsequent new communist movement. One of the main organizations of young people engaging in civil disobedience was called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and it was led by Stokely Carmichael, who eventually changed his name to Kwame Ture. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, it was called SNCC, began using the slogan Black Power in the early 60s and diverged from the mainstream of the civil rights movement by becoming friendlier to Black nationalism. A number of the activists who worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were young African Americans who had resigned from the Communist Party USA in 1958 after it had dropped its support for Black nationalism. Many of them listened to the radio broadcasts of Robert F. Williams, a civil rights leader who advocated armed self-defense and had fled to Cuba. Radio Free Dixie was broadcast from Havana into many southern states, and it featured calls by Williams for the launching of armed struggle by Black nationalists. Among the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee members who listened to Williams' broadcasts and considered themselves to be communists, a clandestine organization called Revolutionary Action Movement was established. The group's aim was to create a new communist party aligned with China that would lead African Americans to form a separate independent Black republic in the South. Malcolm X met with the Revolutionary Action Movement members before his assassination. RAM pamphlets and literature were circulated among young Black activists and civil rights organizers. Eventually, two RAM members, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, broke away to form the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California in 1966. This organization proliferated throughout the 1960s and 70s, although it faced heavy repression from the FBI. And then we have a graphic of the Black Panthers, right? The Black Panther Party emerged as a Marxist-Leninist and Black nationalist organization that had significant base of support among the African-American community during the late 60s. Yeah. I'll address this. Don't worry. There's a technical glitch that we're working on. Don't panic. But I'll address that later. But anyway, we're going to keep going with this reading. The next section, New Leftists Turn to Communism. Among young white activists involved in civil rights, opposition to the Vietnam War and the draft became a new cause to organize around. The first protests against the Vietnam War had been organized by Youth Against War and Fascism and the Progressive Labor Party. But soon a new liberal campus group with a lot of funding emerged. Students for a Democratic Society was founded in Port Huron, Michigan, as a campus-based activist group that opposed the Vietnam War, advocated for civil rights, and sought to create a participatory democracy that involved workers' councils running factories. The group banned communists from joining and received millions of dollars from the Democratic Party-aligned labor union to set up shop on campuses around the country with a crew of full-time paid staff organizers. The founders included Tom Hayden, Michael Harrington, and Todd Gitlin, and they received significant salaries for their work organizing a new activist group on American campuses. The organization aimed to push back against the military-industrial complex and against anti-civil rights conservatives. Progressive Labor Party immediately sent its members to infiltrate SDS, despite its ban on communists and despite efforts to keep them out. Progressive Labor Party found its way into SDS on many campuses. The Communist Party formed a network of W.E.B. Du Bois clubs for young civil rights activists and also joined SDS. With popular rock bands and mainstream media promoting protests against the Vietnam War, The movement grew in big numbers. However, the bulk of those involved were not communists. As anti-war protests grew larger, they were dominated by pacifist religious groups, counterculture hippies who spoke of the generation gap, and a wave of Eastern mystical religious sects with ties to the Central Intelligence Agency, such as Tibetan Buddhists and the International Society of Krishna Consciousness, Hare Krishna. The intellectuals cultivated by the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program set the tone, and the new left was up and running. The message was opposition to conformity, do your own thing, love is all you need, against the establishment of squares and fascists who were uptight. The Rockefeller think tanks, the CIA, the Ford Foundation, and a figure from the Kennedy administration named McGeorge Bundy were funding and fomenting a mass movement for their own reasons. Communists were always there among the wider mobilization of liberal forces, and around the world, it was communist governments that cheered the loudest in support of the Black freedom struggle and in opposition to U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. The climax of the 1960s political upsurge came in 1968 and 1969. In April of 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and every major city went up in flames, with the Black community exploding in rage. A year prior to his assassination, King had denounced the Vietnam War in a speech at Riverside Church. He said, quote, "These are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression. And out of the wounds of the frail world, new systems of justice and equality are emerging as never before. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. We in the West must support these revolutions." King denounced Marxism, but openly spoke of democratic socialism, and he became a friend of SDS founder and Social Democrat Michael Harrington. King was involved in planning a Poor People's Campaign at the time of his death, hoping to mobilize low-income people, white and Black, to engage in a series of civil disobedience protests in Washington, D.C., to demand an expansion of the welfare state. The death of King launched an explosion of rioting in the Black community. Campus radicals at New York City's Columbia University shut down the campus in weeks of prolonged unrest, seizing campus buildings. SDS was the main organization leading the protests, with Mark Rudd acting as the primary public spokesperson. Anti-war Democratic presidential candidate Robert Kennedy, who was associated with support for civil rights protests, was assassinated on June 6th. And here's an image from Columbia University. This is Columbia University, 1968. While the Black community was rioting, the students on the campus seized control of campus buildings in their protest. Just trying to find a comfortable position to read in here. All right. The Democratic Party held its national convention in Chicago and nominated Hubert Humphrey, a pro-war candidate, for president, despite widespread opposition to the war. Outside the convention, thousands of students were beaten and arrested in the streets of Chicago at protests organized by Students for a Democratic Society and the national mobilization to oppose the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election by appealing to the silent majority that objected to the widespread unrest in the country and promised a swift crackdown on the new left and on Black radicals. In 1969, the protests against the Vietnam War got bigger, with 2 national moratorium days and many rallies in Washington, D.C. that drew hundreds of thousands of participants. The Black Panther Party expanded its ranks amid a huge wave of targeted FBI violence, including poison pen letters, assassinations, and other nefarious tactics. In the spring of 1970, when it became clear that the U.S. war in Vietnam had expanded into Cambodia, student protests escalated. Students at Kent State University in Ohio and Jackson State University in Mississippi were shot and killed in protests. To many of those involved in the protests, the issue of racism and the drive for war appeared more and more to be rooted in capitalism. The communists around the world seemed to be on the rise and correct in their explanation of world events. The layer of people who became communists before, during, or shortly after the uprisings of 1968 and 1969 went on to form the nucleus of what is called the new communist movement. An assessment of their experiences, successes, and failures are an essential part of the understanding that lays the basis for the contemporary work of the Center for Political Innovation. So now we have Weatherman and its opponents. That's the next section. And we got a picture of a parade. It says Chicago Progressive Labor Party. The most visible communist organization during the 1960s was the Progressive Labor Party. And that's the sign that says Chicago Progressive Labor Party. And that's the Progressive Labor Party having a parade in like 1960 something, probably 68, 69. Students for a Democratic Society was the main vehicle through which 1960s new leftists moved in a communist direction, who moved in a communist direction converged. Hold on. Sorry about that. Just trying to find a better position to read in. This is a quite large, physically large book. So, I'm just putting it down on the table. All right. The group claimed 2 million members in 1969. By that time, the ban on communists had long been dropped, and two communist factions, both of which took inspiration from China rather than the Soviet Union, dominated the organization. The largest presence within SDS was the Progressive Labor Party. PLP had been founded by pro-Stalin members who had quit the Communist Party in the early 60s. PLP had organized illegal trips to Cuba to defy the travel ban when it was imposed in the early 60s. While the Communist Party concealed its views and operated as a secret, semi-clandestine organization among the wider liberal and pacifist circles, PLP did the opposite, screaming communism at the top of its lungs. PLP was most likely the first communist organization any activist would come into contact with. The group waved red flags, carried big pictures of Stalin and Mao, and sang, "Give me that old communism, give me that old communism, give me that old communism. It's good enough for me," to the tune of "Give me that old time religion." PLP members condemned hippie counterculture as bourgeois decadence and forbade members from using drugs or having long hair. Young recruits to PLP were encouraged to spend their summer break working in factories and selling newspapers to their coworkers. PLP opposed property destruction at campus protests, saying it made more work for campus employees and was therefore anti-working class. By the late 1960s, the politics of Progressive Labor Party were shifting away from the global communist movement. When the Vietnamese National Liberation Front began negotiating with the United States in Paris in the hopes of ending the war, Progressive Labor Party condemned it as selling out and claimed that the, quote, revisionist leaders were holding back a real revolution in Vietnam. PLP members were known to condemn the Vietnamese for shooting at U.S. troops rather than trying to recruit them and give them leaflets as they were, quote, working class. PLP proclaimed revolutionaries must fight nationalism, and on that basis condemned all organizing on nationalist lines, emphasizing a strict workers versus bosses understanding. As the Black Panthers emerged to be the symbol of revolutionary Black activism, Progressive Labor Party condemned the Black Panthers as, quote, Black fascists and reverse racists, invoking Lenin's critique of the Jewish Bund. These positions, along with their anti-counterculture stances, pushed Progressive Labor Party to be more and more isolated among student radicals. Progressive Labor Party also maintained a very dumbed-down political atmosphere, eventually not even referring to Marxism-Leninism or quoting from Marxist texts, but just talking about the need to fight for socialism and win communism and a fight between the workers and the bosses. PLP also began referring to the Soviet government as the, quote, fake red bosses, and more or less distancing itself from communist governments around the world, except for China. After China's foreign policy began shifting in the 1970s, they then denounced China as well. The shift in Progressive Labor Party's politics that was emerging during the late 60s came as a result of internal dynamics. Due to the Black freedom struggle and the role of communists in African liberation, the Progressive Labor Party was becoming a majority Black organization. Bill Epton was a very effective organizer of the group in Harlem and was sent to prison for his activism. The older white leaders of the Progressive Labor Party felt threatened by the number of young Black radicals who joined the organization, but also admired the Black Panthers and the various Soviet-aligned African revolutionaries. In their document, The Five Retreats, A History of Failure of the Progressive Labor Party, Jim Dan and Harry Dillon explained the trajectory of the organization's opposition to the Black Liberation Movement and the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. At the Progressive Labor Party convention of 1968, this is from their document, on the motion of Milt Rosen, the party's Black Liberation Commission, which had been headed by Epton, was stripped of all authority and soon went out of existence. In January of 1969, the party lost its very popular 2-year-old Liberation bookstore in Harlem when the manager, Una Molzik, was expelled from the Progressive Labor Party because she refused to buy PL's retreat from the Black Liberation Movement. Rosen characterized the bookstore as a nationalist center in Harlem. He pushed Epton to struggle with Molzik to change the, quote, nationalist character of it, meaning selling more challenges and less material about Black liberation. Molzik, a well-known Black woman Marxist leader in Harlem, was expelled. She and her co-workers in the bookstore then expelled Progressive Labor Party from the bookstore. Progressive Labor Party had no serious desire to back the bookstore. The party lost interest in the Marxist-Leninist Center in Harlem. Meanwhile, within the National Committee, criticism of Bill Epton, the post of vice president of the party, which he had held since 1965, was quietly abolished. All this more and more clearly indicated a strong craving of Milt Rosen's leadership to get the Black liberation movement out at all costs. Inside of Students for a Democratic Society, Progressive Labor Party pushed opposition to the Black Panthers to supporting the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. They instead wanted SDS members to get jobs in factories and urge their co-workers to, quote, fight the bosses with wildcat strikes as part of a worker-student alliance. Opponents of Progressive Labor Party inside of Students for a Democratic Society, including a lot of the organization's most well-known public faces, took on the name Revolutionary Youth Movement, but soon became known by their nickname Weatherman. After a document which they published entitled "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows," and explaining why they, quote, expelled Progressive Labor Party from their organization, the Revolutionary Youth Movement wrote, SDS is an organization of revolutionary youth. We are a fighting force in the heart of the U.S. empire to struggle against the oppression and exploitation of the people of the world. The Progressive Labor Party Worker Student Alliance Caucus that PL built inside of SDS are counter-revolutionaries who oppose the struggle of the world's people against U.S. imperialism. As could be expected, SDS expelled Progressive Labor and Worker Student Alliance from its ranks. It was as simple as that. We have also come to understand, as white people who live in the heartland of imperialism, that although exploited by capitalism, we receive minor privileges in the form of crumbs off the imperialist table. If we are ever to achieve our own liberation, it must come from fighting on the side of the people of the world against the imperialist monster, fighting on the side of the Vietnamese, blacks, and browns, supporting their struggles and actively participating in international war. Progressive Labor, on the other hand, has been trying to get young people in the country to oppose the struggles of the leaders of the Vietnamese people, of the National Liberation Front, and to oppose the organizations of the Black liberation struggle. Unlike Progressive Labor Party, Revolutionary Youth Movement embraced hippie counterculture and announced that most white workers in America were bought off labor aristocrats or pigs. They argued that counterculture youth who, quote, picked up a joint could be won to the side of the black freedom struggle and that the anti-imperialist countries. White youth must take sides now and bring the war home became the slogans of a wing of long-haired, drug-using activists who called themselves the Americong and waved the Vietnamese NLF flag at protests. Weatherman began staging kick-ass marches where they assembled and broke windows. At the SDS convention, Progressive Labor Party and the Revolutionary Youth Movement parted ways in a chaos-filled gathering, full of fistfights, profanity, and waving of Mao's little red book. The SDS convention was a national news event as it descended into chaos. Both factions announced that they were the real SDS and would organize young radicals to get jobs in that they were the real SDS. The Workers' Student Alliance, Progressive Labor Party, announced that it was holding a work-in and that it would organize young radicals to get jobs in factories. Weatherman announced it was planning for a series of violent protests called the Days of Rage in Chicago for the coming fall. Various youth associated with Weatherman lived together across the country and engaged in a variety of left adventurist street actions in the hopes of building up towards October 8th through the 11th. Weatherman announced that monogamy was reactionary and began encouraging its members to have group sex. The group also required its members to be interrogated while under the influence of LSD to see if they were police infiltrators. Leaders of the Weather Collective houses around the country would subject members to gut checks, pressing them to do illegal and uncomfortable things to see how far they were willing to go. Many within the Progressive Labor Party faction of SDS were extremely uncomfortable with Weatherman's tactics and culture of violence. Bob Avakian, Mike Klonsky, Mary Lou Greenberg, and many others announced they were breaking with Weatherman to form Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, and they denounced the Days of Rage. When the Days of Rage kicked off October 8th, the turnout was quite dismal. A crowd of roughly 300 people smashed windows and dodged police gunfire. Some bombs went off in the following days. Richard Elrod, a prosecuting attorney in Chicago who enjoyed beating up young protesters, was paralyzed for life by a blow from a Weatherman baseball bat to the back of his neck. Hundreds were arrested. Now, here's a picture of the Days of Rage. All right. The Days of Rage that began on October 8th, 1969, was a gross display of left adventurism that revealed that Weatherman had very little support. Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party denounced the Days of Rage. Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party denounced the Days of Rage. He announced that the Black Panthers were aligned with Revolutionary Youth Movement 2. In a TV interview asking if the Panthers supported the Days of Rage, he said, "We believe that the Weatherman action is anarchistic, opportunistic, individualistic, it's chauvinistic, it's custoristic, and that's the bad part about it. It's custoristic in that its leaders take people into situations where the people can be massacred. And they call that a revolution. It's nothing but child's play. It's folly. We think these people may be sincere, but they're misguided, they're muddle heads, and they're scatterbrains." And here is a picture of a press conference. Sorry. Hold on. All right. Oh, okay. All right. Here we go. All right. This is Fred Hampton, leader of the Chicago Black Panthers, speaking alongside Mike Klonsky, leader of the Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 faction of SDS. Both opposed the Weatherman and their Days of Rage. That's Fred Hampton right there, and that's Mike Klonsky of Revolutionary Youth Movement 2. On December 4th, Fred Hampton was murdered in a police assassination. The press declared vicious Panther attack and tried to blame the violence on the Panthers, shooting at police, but tours of the apartment later proved that the Panthers had not fired on the police, not fired a single shot. All the bullets came from the police, who had unloaded hundreds of bullets into Fred Hampton's body while he was sleeping. Hampton had unified the various gangs of Chicago into a rainbow coalition and was organizing them to fight for economic justice. He had started a breakfast program for children that was declared by the FBI to be the greatest internal threat to national security. J. Edgar Hoover wrote in an internal FBI document that the breakfast program promotes at least tacit support for the Black Panther Party among naive individuals. And what is more distressing, it provides the Black Panthers with a ready audience composed of highly impressionable youths. Consequently, the Breakfast for Children program represents the best and most influential activity for the Black Panthers, and as such, is potentially the greatest threat to efforts by authorities to neutralize the Black Panthers and destroy what it stands for. In the aftermath of Hampton's killing in December of 1969, Weathermen convened a National War Council in Flint, Michigan. At the event, they celebrated the recent Manson family murders in Los Angeles and announced plans to launch armed struggle and declared that white workers were, quote, pigs who would go down with the ruling class. The leadership, Bill Ayers, Bernadine Dorn, Jeff Jones, and Mark Rudd, were all children of millionaires who had built up a reputation in the media as outlaws and extremists. All right, so we've got a couple graphics here. All right, first one, Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers led the Weatherman faction of SDS that pushed left adventurous terrorism and embraced hippie counterculture. And then at their National War Council in December of 1969, the Weathermen announced support for the murders of Charles Manson. An account of the National War Council published in The Guardian described how one of the leaders of the Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 confronted the leaders of the Weathermen about their dismissal of the white working class. Quote, Weatherman, virtually all white, continues to promote the notion that white working people in America are inherently counter-revolutionary, impossible to organize, and just plain evil honky bastards, as many Weathermen put it. Weatherman's bleak view of the post-revolutionary world comes from an analysis of American society that says race counts and class doesn't. White workers are in fact fighting for their survival. White workers are in fact fighting for their survival, insisted people doing organizing among factory workers in California. They claim that strikes for wage increases and job security can fairly easily be linked to an anti-imperialist analysis. But Weatherman denies that survival is an issue for white workers. Weatherman leader Howie Matchinger derided white workers for desiring better homes, food, and essentially better lives. Bob Avakian, the Bay Area Revolutionary Union, argued that not only do white workers need those things for their survivals, but black people need them and want them too. The several black people who Weatherman had brought to the meeting shouted right on and waved their fists. Quote, if you can't understand that white workers are being screwed too, and that they are oppressed by capitalism before they are racists, then that just shows your class origins, said Avakian. Matchinger shot back, when you try to defend honky workers who just want more privilege from imperialism, That shows your race origins. The Weathermen position boiled down to an inevitable race war in America, with very few, quote, honkies, except perhaps the 400 people in the room, and a few street kids or gang members who might run with them, surviving the Holocaust. That notion is linked to Weatherman's concept of initiating armed struggle now and not waiting to build mass white support. That is, a small but courageous white fighting force will do material damage that will weaken imperialism, while the Black liberation movement smashes the imperialist motherfucker by itself. Matchinger talked about how the Black liberation movement is so far advanced at this point that the only thing left for white revolutionaries to do is support blacks by fighting cops as a diversionary tactic. Shortly after the Flint War Council, Weatherman disappeared. The overwhelming majority of the members had no information and simply found offices locked and abandoned. Later, a small group of 30 to 60 people began conducting symbolic bombings, operating as a clandestine organization. All right, so now we're going on to the next section. Rim 2, the Party Builders. With Weatherman having disappeared into a small ultra-leftist terrorist organization, Revolutionary Youth Movement, Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 found itself in the position of being the primary communist organization that supported the Black Panthers and the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. Rim 2 was a mishmash of different radicals from around the country, most college-aged. Most lived in houses with other radicals, looked to China as the source of inspiration, and had some kind of aspiration to build a new communist party that would have a base of support among the population, as the Communist Party USA had during the 1930s. Rim 2 met with the Black Panthers and had a close relationship. The Panthers urged white radicals to, quote, organize their own people and be anti-imperialist. Huey Newton eventually planned to merge the various nationalities into a united communist party. This was his theory of intercommunalism. He argued that revolutionary organizations would be formed first on the basis of nationalities and eventually unify. The Young Lords was formed among Puerto Rican Americans, the Brown Berets among Chicanos, I War Kun among Asian Americans. An organization called Young Patriots was formed among Appalachian youth that used the Confederate flag as their symbol and sought to organize low-income white workers. Revolutionary Youth Movement 2 aimed to follow the Panthers' advice and sought to organize white industrial workers into a new communist party that would align with the Black Panthers and the Vietnamese. Rim 2 almost immediately broke up into a variety of different organizations aimed at party building. And here's, two pictures just kind of to show you what these people did, right? Here's one, and these pictures don't have captions because they're just kind of showing you what was going on at the time. But hold on. Hard to get. All right, so that's the October League. Countries want independence, nations want liberation, people want revolution, right? And then this is another crowd. They're marching with the Vietnamese Liberation Front flag. All right. Okay. Mike Klonsky, the son of a high-ranking member of the Communist Party, formed the October League and traveled to China to get the official blessing of Beijing. Bob Avakian, the son of a judge in the Bay Area, formed the Revolutionary Union, which eventually became the Revolutionary Communist Party. H. Bruce Franklin, a professor at Stanford University, he just died, by the way. I did kind of a tribute to him. He died a few weeks ago. Who was fired from his tenured position for encouraging and organizing his students to engage in violent protests, briefly worked for the Revolutionary Union before forming his own organization called Venceremos. Jerry Tung, a Chinese-born activist in New York City, led the Asian Study Group, a Marxist education circle aimed at Asian Americans and those who did not speak English. Jerry Tung went to prison briefly on charges of inciting a riot, and once he was released, his organizational work rapidly increased. Eventually, the Asian Study Group emerged to be the Workers' Viewpoint Organization, a communist group that set up offices around the country. Among those who worked with them was Michio Kaku, the famous physicist. In October of 1979, the organization changed its name to the Communist Workers' Party and was unique in that it was a majority Asian American organization, whereas most of the radical organizations were primarily white. Nelson Peary, an older activist who had broken with the Communist Party, formed the Communist League, which eventually became the Communist Labor Party. The group gained significant influence in Detroit, recruiting during the labor upsurge among auto workers. A group called the Communist Party USA Marxist-Leninist was formed by Michael Lasky and eventually began coordinating with British academic Hardiel Baines, who formed a network of communist parties that eventually aligned with Albania. The well-known African-American poet and playwright Amiri Baraka, also known as Leroy Jones, changed the name of his black nationalist organization, the Congress of African People, to the Revolutionary Communist League Marxist-Leninist. In 1974, the organization maintained a presence among black radicals and eventually merged into the League of Revolutionary Struggle Marxist-Leninist with Chicano and Asian Americans in 1978. The group ran black cultural centers in Newark, New Jersey, and other parts of the country. A number of smaller organizations emerged as well. Well, first I'll show you. This is Amiri Baraka, right? African-American poet and playwright Amiri Baraka formed his own communist organization, the Revolutionary Communist League Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong Thought, in 1974. That's Amiri Baraka is a very famous poet and playwright, very well known. A number of smaller organizations emerged as well. A few older communists in Boston who had broken with the Communist Party in the 1950s and supported China and Albania formed Youth for Stalin and Rayolite Group. The Central Organization of United States Marxist-Leninists, eventually called itself the Marxist-Leninist Party USA, came into existence. A slew of newspapers and collectives with names like Seize the Time, the Sojourner Truth Organization, the Revolutionary Workers League, the Proletarian Unity League, and the Red Dawn Committee Marxist-Leninist Can you still hear me? Okay, yeah. The Red Dawn Committee Marxist-Leninist began operating. The number of tiny pro-Beijing sects is too numerous to count. The Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Workers' Party, the Communist Labor Party, and the October League, eventually called the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, all had a few thousand members. The other organizations, which were quite numerous, mostly had less than 100 members in total, often just 5 to 10. The Guardian newspaper was the publication that functioned as the new communist movement's main forum for debate and discourse. Irwin Silber, a folk singer who had worked with Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, was the editor. Irwin Silber used The Guardian to try and unify the groups by convening forums and events featuring the different organizations and by publishing news about what the various organizations were doing. Monthly Review was the new communist movement's academic magazine and book publisher. The Guardian was subsidized by Beijing starting in 1972. According to Max Elbaum's History of the NCM, Revolution in the Air, 60s Radicals Turned to Lenin, Mao, and Che. Elbaum writes, managing editor Jack Smith visited China. Smith was less ideologically oriented than Silber, but he was attuned to currents that might provide support to the always struggling newspaper. He returned with an agreement for The Guardian to sponsor tours to China, which could provide a vehicle for U.S. activists to experience the Chinese Revolution close up and simultaneously raise funds. Some estimate as many as 2 million people may have been affiliated with the new communist movement at one time or another based on polling conducted at the time. Others estimate the political current to be much smaller, consisting of perhaps only 20,000 to 60,000 dedicated activists. For the course of the 1970s, the NCM was a highly visible part of American life. Movies and popular culture from the time reflect how prevalent it was, despite being a fringe political element. Movies like Car Wash, Network, and Switchblade Sisters reflect this. And we got a poster from Switchblade Sisters. The film Switchblade Sisters, 1975, depicts a female biker gang who acquire firearms from a group of black women whose home is decorated with pictures of Stalin and Mao. It's a real movie. You can watch it on YouTube. Every pro-union, black liberation, or anti-war protest in the 1970s included a crowd of people waving red flags, carrying pictures of Mao Zedong, and chanting about the workers and the bosses. The groups clashed with each other rapidly and struggled to build a base among the population as the country and the world was rapidly changing in the 1970s. So, folks, I am going to keep reading for now. We've been going for about an hour and 5 minutes. I'm going to try to read this entire chapter to you tonight. But if you have any super chats you want me to answer before I end the stream, please send them. We've only got one so far. It's a good one about Kshama Sawant, but we've only got one so far. So if you can send super chats for the second half of the show, that would be great. I'm going to keep reading, and we'll probably stop a little after midnight. So if I'm not finished with it, I'll have to pick up another time, or you'll have to just go buy the book, Out of the Movement to the Masses. But this is what I feel like doing because we got a lot going on, and I'm getting a lot of attention for my book on Kamala Harris, and I'm proud of that. So yeah, there we go. All right. In 1961, China and the Soviet Union parted ways. The initial reason for the split, and this is a section called China's Changing Politics. And I'll just read the picture there and the caption. All right. Mao Zedong's close ally and collaborator, Lin Biao, Mao Zedong's close ally and collaborator, died under mysterious circumstances in September of 1971. His plane crashed while fleeing to the Soviet Union. I'll just check a couple things quickly here, right? Okay. All right. Okay. In 1961, China and the Soviet Union parted ways. The initial reason for the split was Khrushchev's policies of three peacefuls. Khrushchev had laid out a strategy for opposing the West based on peaceful coexistence between capitalist and socialist countries, peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism, and peaceful economic competition between capitalist and socialist countries. The idea was that the Soviet Union would do everything possible to prevent war with the capitalist West, peaceful coexistence, and would figure out how to more effectively churn out material goods, peaceful competition, and that eventually the capitalist countries would see that socialism was more efficient and gradually, one step at a time, become socialist themselves, peaceful transition. China strongly objected to these policies, believing that colonized nations had the right to take up arms against the imperialists and that socialist countries would always struggle when faced with the encirclement and threats of the imperialists, and that the idea that the Western countries would gradually become socialist bit by bit was utter delusion. Utter delusion. They accused Khrushchev of being revisionist, the term coined by Edward Bernstein to describe his pro-imperialist theory that capitalism would gradually turn into socialism. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing. When China and Albania were economically cut off by the Soviet Union, in response to their sharp critiques, China rallied its allies around the world to form new communist parties that took direction from Beijing rather than Moscow. After a few years, China launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, mobilizing the youth to, quote, bombard the headquarters and drive out the, quote, capitalist roaders from the government. Lin Biao, The general in the People's Liberation Army compiled the Little Red Book of quotations from Chairman Mao. Lin Biao functioned as the leading figure of the early years of the Cultural Revolution and composed a document called Long Live the Victory of People's War, arguing that Mao's strategy of guerrilla warfare could be applied on a global scale. The text used similar language to Che Guevara's call to make 2 and 3 many Vietnams. All right, I'm going to skip the big long quotes. You can go read them. The quotes from Lin Biao. All right. I just kind of used them to kind of explain the Chinese position, but I'm going to skip them tonight. All right, skipping to the next page. February of 1967 marked the climax of the first stage of the Cultural Revolution, with followers of Lin Biao seizing control of Shanghai in the famous January Storm. Shanghai was declared to be an autonomous people's commune in which direct workers' democracy reigned. Shortly afterward, Mao Zedong criticized the move, and the People's Commune was dissolved. Shang Chunxiao, the editor of the Communist newspaper of Shanghai, assumed leadership and argued that mob rule and chaos was insufficient to maintain a socialist government. With the backing of Mao and his wife, Jiang Qing, regional revolutionary committees, led by the military, were established as the new ruling bodies of the local organs of the Communist Party, ending chaos and mob rule. And then I quote from that. I quote some more stuff about this shift when they got rid of Lin Biao and you had the rise of the Gang of Four. As Lin Biao moved more into the background, Zhang Shenqiao, Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing, and 2 other individuals known as the Gang of Four became the primary voices of Chinese communism. When the Soviet Union intervened in Czechoslovakia to remove a U.S.-backed, quote, democratic socialist who had seized power, China rolled out a new phrase, Soviet social imperialism. No longer was the Soviet Union simply revisionist, but now China was proclaiming that the USSR was another empire, another capitalist imperialist society, and that the Cold War was merely an inter-imperialist rivalry. China began providing military aid and training to U.S.-backed anti-communist fighters in Angola, who assassinated members of the pro-Soviet movement for the liberation of the people of Angola that fought against the Portuguese colonizers. The death of Lin Biao took place on September 13th, 1971, and the circumstances remain shrouded in mystery. It is generally understood that he attempted some kind of coup against Mao Zedong and other leading party figures and then fled to the Soviet Union after it failed. His plane crashed in Mongolia. This is a picture of Jiang Qing. All right. Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, led a faction called the Gang of Four that came into prominence after the fall of Lin Biao. They steered China's foreign policy in a pro-U.S. and anti-Soviet direction. After the fall of Lin Biao, the Gang of Four steered Chinese foreign policy in an increasingly pro-U.S. direction. China proclaimed the USSR to be the main danger to the people of the world. China's Red Guard youth were deported from the cities and sent to do farm labor in the countryside. Efforts to expand China's industrial output were frequently interrupted by strikes and political mobilizations by the Gang of Four. U.S. President Richard Nixon visited China in 1972, and he was given a hero's welcome. They also proclaimed that a third world war was inevitable. William Hinton, and I have a long quote about how China was saying that there was going to be World War III and it was inevitable. These shifting politics confused many young radicals in the United States who were attempting to build a new communist party aligned with Beijing. For them, condemnation of the U.S. imperialist war in Vietnam had become a central aspect of their radicalization. To now follow a government that saw Nixon as an ally and the Soviet-aligned Vietnamese movement as, quote, agents of Soviet imperialism was extremely confusing. Some of the new communist movement organizations simply disregarded China's foreign policy while still hailing the Cultural Revolution and celebrating China as a stronghold of socialism. When the Watergate scandal and a congressional inquiry paved the way for Nixon's resignation in 1974, China viewed him as an ally. However, the Revolutionary Union, a precursor to the Revolutionary Communist Party, held national marches on Washington to, quote, throw the bum out. Some of the rhetoric of the Revolutionary Union activists almost seem to be calling for his ouster by the deep state, with speakers saying things like, we don't care if his helicopter crashes or he gets lost on the way to the John, we just want him out. When the CIA toppled the Chilean government in 1973 and oversaw the brutal slaughter of thousands of leftists, China embraced Augusto Pinochet as an ally against the main danger, the Soviet Union. However, many young China-aligned communists joined protests in support of Salvador Allende against the U.S. government-backed coup. The October League Marxist-Leninist, which later changed its name to the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, defined itself as being the most solidly in line with Beijing in terms of foreign policy. Mike Klonsky, the chairman of the CPML, frequently traveled to China, and the group more or less had China's official backing. The Revolutionary Communist Party defined itself as the most visible and most blatantly pro-communist, convening rallies with red flags and portraits of Mao, but it often strayed from or flat out ignored Chinese foreign policy. Right? Here's Mike Klonsky, the leader of the October League, toasting with Hao Guofeng, the leader of China, who was Mao's first successor before Deng Xiaoping. All right. The slew of other organizations fit somewhere in between. The groups exchanged harsh polemics against each other and often physically attacked each other. The FBI subsequently infiltrated all the groups, and this was revealed by the New York Times. Subsequent academic work has revealed that the role of Western Goals, a private intelligence service set up by members of the John Birch Society, which trained members to become FBI informants inside of communist organizations. Joe Burton, an FBI informant inside the new communist movement, received a great deal of attention when he went public and even sued the FBI for violating his civil rights. Burton told the New York Times and The Guardian how he had been sent to infiltrate communist groups and attempt to entrap members into illegal activities. Burton spread false rumors among communist groups, incited groups to attack each other, and functioned as part of a whole network of FBI informants and infiltrators that caused dysfunction and confusion among the communists. Burton had established his own communist group based in New Orleans called the Red Star Cadre, and had used it to establish links and sow discord among communist groups throughout the country. He said, quote, the Bureau got me into believing that we were looking for guns, explosives, and people who were actively blowing things up, other countries who were infiltrating over here, and groups and individuals whose goal was to overthrow our constitutional form of government. And it wouldn't be hard for me to be antagonistic toward people like that. But the truth of the matter was, after 18 months, that wasn't what they were doing. There was no reason at the time, 1972, for me not to accept what the FBI told me is true. Only after knowing these people for a while and doing monthly analysis on what we were doing, do people come to the conclusion that at no time in that period did I ever see any reason to believe that any of these people were armed beyond the point what they could legally be armed as private citizens. I testified to the Senate committee that there were no arms, no ammunition, no bombs, no explosives, no money. The Guardian quoted local activists as saying they had all caught on that something was off about Joe Burton. With longtime Tampa activist reporting, nearly everyone was suspicious of him from the beginning. It was clear to us that if he was not a cop, he was missing a paycheck. He would promote splits, distrust, and confusion. Don H. Wright, a member of the National Committee of the Revolutionary Communist Party, is revealed to have been an FBI informant who used the issue of race and his African-American background to manipulate the organization. All right. Next section we're doing is called Wildcat Summer in Detroit. All right. The various sects that made up the new communist movement all more or less adopted the same strategy. They got jobs in factories and sought to win their co-workers over to communism. They adopted their own interpretations of how to carry out the methods spelled out in J. Peters' Manual on Organization, published by the Communist Party in the 1930s. They formed shop nuclei. They published specific newspapers for their workplaces. They tried to divide their co-workers into the advanced, the center, and the right, and strategize how to recruit the advanced, neutralize the center, and defeat the right. The only city where the new communist movement seems to have been highly successful in gaining influence among industrial workers was Detroit. Motor City in Michigan was an overwhelmingly African American and a center of the automobile manufacturing. A communist magazine called Inner City Voice was published throughout the city after the 1968 riots. The FBI worked to stop the magazine from being published. The book Detroit, I Do Mind Dying by Dan Georgakis and Marvin Serkin describes, quote, the FBI made a practice of visiting shops which produced the paper and inquiring why their owners were supporting subversion. The usual result was an immediate refusal to print any more issues. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? As a result of the FBI and union harassment, the Inner City Voice never printed in the same shop twice. The consequence of the doubling attack was that the copy had to be taken to Chicago. The printed papers were then trucked back to Detroit for distribution. Kenneth Cockrell, an African-American attorney who identified as a communist, became a hero for the black community for two major courtroom acquittals he secured. The first was a victory for a group of black nationalists from the Republic of New Africa who had gotten into a shootout with the police, or who had assassinated some local heroin dealers and then gotten into a shootout with the police who were protecting them. The second was for Jimmy Johnson, a black auto worker who murdered his white co-workers after he was wrongfully terminated. The publishers of Inner City Voice, including Ken Cockrell and General Baker, formed the League of Revolutionary Black Workers as a group of black communists operating in the city. The Motor City Labor League was established for white allies. Ken Cockrell and his allies at Wayne State University eventually seized control of South End, the campus newspaper, and transformed it into a communist publication with the slogan, "One class-conscious worker is worth 100 students." Printed on the masthead. South End was edited by Mike Hamlin and Luke Tripp, two members of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and they battled the university in court to maintain control of the publication and funds and use it to promote communism throughout the city. Soon, black auto workers were organized into a faction called the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, which accused the UAW leadership of being racist and pro-imperialist and aimed to transform the Auto Workers Union into a communist one aligned with China and the Black Panthers. Drum members protested outside the headquarters of the United Auto Workers, chanting, "We finally got the news about how our dues are being used. We finally got the news about how our dues are being used." The summer of 1973 was known as Wildcat Summer in Detroit. As major industrial actions were being led by communists, and they dominated local headlines. On July 24th, two black auto workers who had previously been members of the Black Panthers seized control of the electrical power cage at their factory. Some 214 of the 300 workers at the plant had demanded a supervisor who was known for his racist comments and actions be fired. When the company refused to listen to them, Larry Carter and Isaac Shorter went into the electrical cage and turned off the power in the factory, shutting down the assembly line. Hundreds of workers from nearby factories joined them as they barricaded themselves into the electrical cage, refusing to come out unless the racist boss was fired and they were granted immunity for their actions. After 13 hours, the company gave in. Workers carried Carter and Shorter out of the factory on their shoulders, cheering. Isaac Shorter told the press, "The black workers in this city could control it, but at the same time, there's no such thing as black control, because it's not a racial thing. It's a system, which is a capitalist system. It oppresses all people, blacks, whites, Chicanos, you name it, yellow, brown, and it's the way we should look at it as being." On August 28th, another factory was shut down by a wildcat strike when 16 workers were fired for reporting health and safety violations. This strike was primarily made up of white workers, though the leader and spokesperson was Jerome Scott, an African-American worker who was part of the Communist League led by Nelson Peary. The local UAW boss, Doug Frazier, went to the factory the next day and urged workers outside with picket signs to return to work, but they didn't listen. After 6 days, the company gave in and agreed to address health and safety violations and rehire the workers that were wrongfully fired. The very next day, another factory was shut down by William Gilbreth, a leader of the Progressive Labor Party. He had been fired for handing out leaflets about bad conditions on the job. He returned to work for his normal shift after being fired and sat down on top of the assembly line, bringing the plant production to a halt. 200 workers joined him in occupying the plant for a sit-down strike. The police stormed into the plant and arrested 15 workers, clearing out the strikers. The next day, workers at the factory who wanted to continue the strike had a pitched battle with a mob of more conservative workers organized by the United Auto Workers to break this, quote, illegal strike. In 1972, a communist named Justin Ravitz, who had worked closely with Kenneth Cockrell, was elected for a 10-year term as a local judge. He quoted Mao Zedong from the bench. He fined corporations for serving rotten meat to the public, and he forced rapists to study communist literature on the oppression of women before their sentencing. Ravitz removed the U.S. flag from the courtroom and engaged in provocative activities from his elected seat on the bench, quoting Marx and Lenin in speeches to the court and using his position to promote communist politics. He served as Detroit's recorder court judge from 1973 to 1986, presiding over mainly felony cases. So I got a couple photographs here. All right. This is, all right, Larry Carter and Isaac Shorter, two Detroit auto workers, seized control of the electrical cage at their factory to demand their racist boss be fired. That's when they won, being carried out on their shoulder by the co-workers as heroes. And then we have the communist judge, right? Justin C. Ravitz, a Maoist communist, was elected to serve as recorder court judge on Detroit from 1973 to 1986. All right. We'll keep going for a little bit here. In 1973, Coleman Young was elected as mayor of Detroit on a platform of abolishing a particularly vicious wing of the police department known for its brutality. At the time he was elected, Coleman Young was very friendly with both the Communist Party USA and a number of MCM groups. And Trotskyite groups. He stayed in office until 1994, though his politics shifted and were not consistently radical. Abayomi Azikiwe, founder of the Pan-African Newswire, described the pivotal mayor. Quote, Detroit's first African-American mayor, Coleman Young, who governed from 1974 to 1993, built his political reputation through grassroots involvement as a left-wing trade union organizer with the National Negro Labor Councils during the 40s and 50s. Young was brought before the Legislative Committee on Un-American Activities during the early 50s. He stood up to right-wing congressional members, challenging their racist remarks and refusing to answer questions related to his membership and ties to the communist left. In 1973, Young, with the support of a broad alliance of African-American political forces, along with progressive and liberal whites, became the first black mayor of Detroit. He immediately set out to rid the city of racist cops and other municipal employees, instituting an affirmative action program that was challenged by law enforcement and other reactionary political forces. However, compromises were necessary to maintain capital investment in Detroit. At the close of the Young administration, the city was suffering from massive job losses, an inadequate and declining public transportation system, and the collapse of municipal infrastructure. General Baker, a black auto worker and founder of Drum, eventually became a member of the Communist Labor Party, and he ran for a Detroit seat in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1976. An article published by his campaign wrote, "Despite the lies and propaganda on television, in the schools, and in the newspapers, people cannot be fooled about socialism any longer. They have learned that this capitalist system is the most savage, barbaric system in the history of the world. With the capacity to feed the entire world, there has never been so much starvation. With the possibility of peace, there has never been so much bloodshed. With the need for housing and school never greater, never has there been such unemployment. Capitalism is a system that demands that honest working people bow down and take orders from common criminals. That is why we must change, and that is what this campaign is all about. The goal of this campaign is to imbue the people of the United States of North America with a burning desire and will to fight for socialism, because the socialist system means real freedom, jobs, because without a job, there is no food, shelter, and clothing. And without food and shelter and clothing, there is no life. It means getting up in the morning and knowing the battery is going to be in your car so you can drive to work. It means coming home at night and knowing your television is going to be there. Because once people are capable of living without stealing from their neighbors, stealing will stop. It means living in a friendly town where national hatred has ended and people are no longer afraid of one another because of the color of their skin or the language that they speak. This can only come with socialism. The working class must end the capitalist system that is based on and thrives upon murder, starvation, and misery for the masses of people. There is no need for a system that can only produce want and hunger for the many and vast wealth for the few. The system must be swept away, and the working class can do it. Ezekwe noted that starting in the 70s, auto plants and other factories in Detroit began closing because the city was known for its militant atmosphere among workers. Quote, since the 1970s, the owners of capital have strategically relocated outside the region into areas where a higher profit rate could be accrued through the super exploitation of labor. All right, so it is after midnight. I guess I'll show you the one picture here. This is General Baker, I was reading you his campaign literature. General Baker, the Detroit auto worker who joined the Communist Labor Party, ran for office on a communist platform, became an icon of labor radicalism in the city. That's like the first half of chapter 3 of this book. So go and buy this book if you want the rest. Maybe I'll finish reading it on a future stream. But yeah, names and locations, folks. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. Who's with us? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. I will call you all out as I see you. Then after that, I'll answer y'all's questions, and then I am going to bed. All right. Rachel Winder in Georgia. Welcome, Rachel. Ryan in Kansas City. Patrick in Maine. Jenny in Cincinnati. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Amsterdam, Netherlands. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm here. Joe in Cary, North Carolina. Ed in Louisville. Scott in Maryland. Names and locations. Names and locations. Conrad in Poland. Mariah in North Carolina. Mike in Oakland. Mr. Foster in D.C. Penny in Minnesota. Names and locations, names and locations. Barry in Utah, St. Joseph, USA. Utica, Mark Jones. You weren't first tonight. What's going on? Ellie in Chicago, welcome. Fingerman in Missouri. St. David's, Bermuda, welcome, welcome, welcome. Names and locations, names and locations. Who is with us? Who is with us? Names and locations, names and locations. Arthur in Nova Scotia. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Names and locations, names and locations. All righty. Carolyn in Moldova. Very good. All right. All right. Matt in Green Bay. Welcome, Matt. Very good. All right. So I'm going to answer people's super chat questions. Super chats are great because not only do they give me something to talk about in the second half of our show, don't know how long it'll be tonight. I got 5 questions here. Tyblee in Pennsylvania. But yeah, I'm a little tired tonight. I got a lot on my mind. So that's why I just read to you all. I read to you all, and then I will answer people's questions, and then I'm going to go to bed because I got to get up for church in the morning, and I got a lot on my mind, but that's okay. Quick reminder that we do have morning messages every morning on the CPI YouTube channel. Go to the Center for Political Innovation YouTube channel to get our morning messages. If you want to submit a morning message, there's a link to submit morning messages. We constantly need more morning messages. So now I'm going to start answering people's questions. If you got any super chats, throw them my way. And here we go. Is Kshama Sawant a good organizer? I would say yes. She's a good organizer. Her beliefs do not line up with mine. She's a Trotskyite. She's very anti-China. Oh, Terry in Portland. Very good. She's a Trotskyite. She's very anti-China. I've said that if AOC really believed what she claimed, she would be Kshama Sawant. Right? Now, Kshama Sawant has a very woke edge to her. Kshama Sawant is not anti-imperialist sufficiently because she's a Trotskyite. But at the same time, she used her position as someone who genuinely really believes what they're saying. She opened up City Hall. She used her keys to City Hall to open it up to Black Lives Matter activists. And they attacked her for doing that. Good for her. She organized against Amazon and in support of the Amazon union. She did a lot of things. Oh, Gabby in Chicago. She did a lot of things that if one was a genuine believer in what Trotskyites believe, and what the woke left believes, one would do. I believe that Kshama Sawant is sincere. I don't think AOC is sincere. I think Kshama Sawant is sincere. I just think she's wrong. She's not anti-imperialist. She doesn't want to reach out to Trump supporters and win them to a class struggle program. She is hostile to socially conservative folks. So her beliefs are different than mine, but I think she is genuine in her beliefs. And I think the fact that she was able to snag a city council seat in a major city in the United States shows a very effective organizational prowess, and that she built a very effective Trotskyite organization. So it's not that I think she's a bad organizer. She's a great organizer. And in fact, among Trotskyites, she's probably one of the most effective of all the people in this country who say they believe in communism. She's probably one of the most effective. I think her beliefs are wrong. But at the same time, I think that for someone who believes what she believes, she's pretty good at putting her beliefs into practice. I mean, you asked me for a question, is she a good organizer? And my answer, you didn't ask me if I agreed with her. You didn't ask me if she was right. You just said, is she a good organizer? And I don't know how anyone could say anything but yes, she is. She's clearly a good organizer. She might be doing things I disagree with, but she's a very, very good organizer. No one can deny that. So you asked me that, I'm giving you an honest answer. I think she is a very good organizer. So there you go. Yeah. A lot of us are. But, yeah, there you go. But yeah, that's my answer. Is she a good organizer? I would say yes. Yes, she is. All right. Why do Tibetans want freedom from China? They don't. No, Tibetans that live in the United States want to break Tibet away from China. Tibetans who live in Nepal and are anti-China activists want that. The Dalai Lama, who's been on the payroll of the CIA for a long time, they want that. But Tibet had a big civil war in the 1950s in which 500,000 people died. And China has done a huge amount to raise living standards in Tibet and, poverty alleviation, etc. In addition to that, the Chinese government now sponsors Tibetan Buddhism. And the Chinese government has built Tibetan monasteries and all of that. And the overwhelming majority of the people living in Tibet are really happy about all the running water and electricity the Chinese Communist Party has brought them, all the new highways and electrification programs. And the people living in Tibet are sympathetic to the Chinese government. There was a very, very visible and violent minority of Tibet separatists at one point, but they've been completely neutralized at this point because China has done so much to alleviate poverty in Tibet that the Tibet separatism thing is gone. It's completely gone. It exists in the West. There's a bunch of Tibetans who fled in the 50s and are mad at the Chinese government, and they have a lot of influence, but there you go. So there we go. All right. Can you share insights you have on Che Guevara? Well, let me say this, right? That, Che Guevara, part of the new left is, just worshiping Che Guevara. And there's many biographies of him, and he is just the ideal revolutionary. My views of him are somewhat nuanced. I think he was a very heroic individual. I think he's a person who made great self-sacrifice. He came from privilege. He came from a position of privilege, and he took great risks and ultimately gave his life for very impoverished people in South America. He was from Argentina, but he gave his life to the Cuban Revolution, and he ultimately died in Bolivia fighting for the Bolivian people. He fought in the Congo for the African people. So I think we can agree that Che Guevara was a very, very moral and self-sacrificing person who really believed in what he was doing. That said, I would argue that Che Guevara, first of all, his ideas about economics, the Cuban government now realizes were very wrong. His theory of the new socialist man, the idea that you can build a socialist society without material incentives. It was a disaster. When he was running the National Bank of Cuba, the policies were not good, right? You need material incentives in a society that, when you're building a communist or a socialist government in poverty, there's going to be inequality, and you can't declare equality. The basis of equality is abundance. And the Cuban government now says that Che Guevara's economic policies were a disaster. And I agree with that. And that a lot of the biographies of Che Guevara and a lot of the communists who romanticize Che Guevara, try to pretend otherwise. And they say, oh, Che Guevara was building this ideal, genuine democratic socialism. No, he was not. He was trying to impose equality with heavy-handed state repression with no material incentives, and it didn't work. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'll say about Che Guevara was that, while he was right to call out the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was kind of restraining people around the world who wanted independence, he very much was obsessed with armed struggle. He very much believed in violence. And that, look, the people who hate Che Guevara, the conservatives, right, who have the Che crossed out shirts and all of that, they have a lot of very accurate quotes from Che Guevara about how much he loved violence and killing. I mean, Che Guevara very much romanticized violence and killing. And he was somebody who, he had gotten involved in militarism and war, and he got a taste of that. And he was somebody who was very, very violent, right? And that after the Cuban Revolution, of 1959, there was a wave of executions in Cuba where a lot of people were sent to firing squads. I mean, like thousands and thousands of people from the old regime were executed, and it was really ugly. And Che Guevara was very enthusiastic and excited about it, and he was, sentencing people to death and all of that. And I'm not saying that wasn't, these were not people who had killed a lot of people or had starved a lot of people, had been part of a very corrupt old regime, but that's pretty ugly also. Che Guevara, he was someone from a wealthy class who really felt for the downtrodden and the oppressed. But he also had a big chunk of that dark side of communism in him, right? He loved killing. He loved violence. He loved chaos, he also thought one could create equality by imposing it. And the communist movement of the world has largely rejected that idea. The communist movement has gotten back to what Marx said, which is the only basis for building an egalitarian society is vast abundance, right? It is only when you overcome scarcity that you can have full equality. Communism lays the basis for doing that by eliminating the irrationality of capitalism. But you cannot have a society where everyone's equal unless you have a huge amount of wealth first. And China tried Cultural Revolution, they did this, and Pol Pot, and this idea that you can create equality forcibly is not only wrong, but it leads to very disastrous things, right? And Che Guevara tried to do that, and he was wrong about that. And second of all, Che Guevara, look, you and I didn't grow up in Latin America in the pre-World War II years. Okay, these societies are very, very repressive and very, very violent. And he's somebody who grew up in a wealthy class, but he saw a lot of injustice. He saw a lot of cruelty, and that created in him a very satanic desire for vengeance. And we can call that out for what it is, right? That, I mean, look, we don't want a society where people are being lined up and shot. We don't want that, right? You know, I don't believe in the death penalty. Ultimately, I'd like to see a world where there is no death penalty. I know that some countries are under different conditions, etc., but Che Guevara was a product of his time, and he did amazing, heroic things, fighting for the downtrodden and the oppressed, enabling Cuba to break free and build up its modern healthcare system, and ultimately, he put his body on the line and he got killed for what he believed in. So I admire him. But I also see in Che Guevara a lot of the communism we need to break with, a lot of the satanic stuff, that a lot of the baggage our movement has. The legacy of the French Revolution and the guillotine was also there. So it's complicated. Another thing that I will warn you about with Che Guevara that you got to be very careful of. I have a book somewhere that's a great example of this. It's on a shelf over there that I can't get to. It's behind my equipment. But Che Guevara died in 1968. He died. And so because he died, a lot of people project all kinds of things onto him that are not true, right? There are a lot of Trotskyites that say, oh, Che Guevara was a Trotskyist. He believed in workers' democracy and pure egalitarianism. That's not true. Che Guevara was not a Trotskyist. Che Guevara went to North Korea, and he said that Cuba should model itself on North Korea. Che Guevara was an admirer of Stalin. He praised Stalin endlessly. Che Guevara was not a Trotskyist, but he died. And so Trots assume, oh, well, if only Che had lived, his vision of socialism was this Trotskyite thing. And they say that because he died, right? There are Maoists who maintain that Fidel Castro was a sellout for the evil Soviet Union, but Che Guevara was a Maoist, and he wasn't. Che Guevara was Che Guevara, right? And that there is an endless amount of, this is my problem with the middle class woke left, is that if you want them to admire you, die. Don't build socialism. Don't actually take power. Don't actually have a government. No. Just go out and die. And then they can write a million books about, oh, if only you had lived, you would have created real communism. You would be. That's why they all love Trotsky. That's why they all love Rosa Luxemburg. That's why they all love Che Guevara. That's why they all love anarchists in Spain. This middle class left that has no touch with reality. They have nothing to do with any country that's actually building communism, like China, like the Soviet Union, like modern Cuba, like Vietnam. Communism is just this heaven on earth in their heads. They are constantly looking for somebody who died, who they can say was a real communist. And it is so sad. And so Che Guevara died. And he had some kind of falling out with Fidel Castro, and then he died. And so because of that, there's an endless amount of, oh, Che was the real communist, unlike the evil Stalinists. And it's so childish. And it reveals a real weakness on the part of our movement intellectually, right? I just gave you an assessment of Che Guevara that, one, very, very heroic, self-sacrificing person. Two, somebody who in their personality and psychology, they demonstrated a lot of the things that are very unhealthy about the left, and had ideas about economics that were incorrect. That is a nuanced view. I wear Che Guevara t-shirts. I will admire Che Guevara's heroism, but I will also tell you that there were some problems there too. But, that's a nuanced view. But on the left, generally, if you have a t-shirt of Stalin, oh my God, Stalin, mass murdering dictator, because he was in power. But Che Guevara, he can do no wrong because he was just, so I don't know. That's my thoughts about Che Guevara. And that Che Guevara he's really a representative of the wave of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements that swept the United States post-World War II. That's very much what Che Guevara stood for. He was, there was a wave in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America post-World War II. There was a wave of national liberation and communist movements that swept the world. Che Guevara was probably the most visible symbol of it. He became like the icon or the saint of that movement, right? They were mostly aligned with the Soviet Union, but they were much more radical than the Soviet Union, and they were fighting for very, very impoverished countries to break free from imperialism. And Che Guevara was a representative of that period, and that those national liberation struggles were correct. And it's because of that, because of those national liberation struggles, that many countries have been able to industrialize and develop. So again, I'm giving you a nuanced view. There we go. I'm giving you a nuanced view. And I mean, if you're somebody who idealizes Che Guevara, you're probably very disappointed by what I said. But if you're an anti-communist who hates Che Guevara, you probably think, how dare you? He was just a mass murdering brutal. I don't think that either. I think he's a nuanced figure. Che Guevara is probably a lot like George Washington, right? George Washington, great leader who fought the British Empire, great leader who enabled our country to break free from the British Empire and develop, but slave owner, not good. Killed Native Americans, not good. We can have a nuanced view of George Washington. I have a similar view of Che Guevara. Again, great leader who helped break Cuba free from imperialism, believed in what he was doing, made great sacrifices. On the other hand, bad economic theories that distorted Marxism, and also a kind of bloodlust and desire for vengeance and fetish for violence that was not healthy. And I think we should be able to have a clear-headed assessment of this, right? The way I used to think when I was in the Workers' World Party and when I was part of the left, the way I used to think was, fuck George Washington. He's an imperialist colonizer. There's nothing good about George Washington. And Che Guevara, the greatest hero who's ever existed. He can do no wrong. No. Now I don't think either of those things. I think that both George Washington and Che Guevara were very admirable in their own ways, and that both of them had flaws that are worth pointing out. I have a nuanced view of both figures, and I think that if we're building a movement here in America, we should admire George Washington despite his flaws. And if we are anti-imperialists who oppose the system of imperialism around the world, we should admire Che Guevara despite his flaws. But we can admit those flaws and we can be nuanced, and that's important. So there you go. I'm trying to get, if we're going to actually build a movement for socialism and anti-imperialism, we need, thank you. We need to be able to have a nuanced conversation. I support George Washington. I support Che Guevara, but I admit that they both had big flaws. They both did a lot of bad things along with all the good that they did. And they both had some ideas that were wrong. So let's just be honest about all of this. All right. I hope that was helpful. All right. That's a good point, David. Yeah, I didn't even watch the Netanyahu thing. Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. Well, in the 1990s, China pivoted in a very the global communist movement was in retreat, and there were clearly divisions within the Chinese Communist Party. And Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, they both kind of represented that period in China. And I think Jiang Zemin is the one who eventually said they wanted to adopt the Western system. And while they are still both admired, none of them have been repudiated or whatever. They also, at this point, from what I understand, their ideas, and particularly Jiang Zemin's ideas, have been repudiated. China now says they will never adopt the Western system. But Jiang Zemin is the one who notoriously said that. He said eventually China will adopt the Western system. And that represented probably a very large viewpoint within the Chinese Communist Party at that time. But that view has been completely repudiated. Xi Jinping does not believe that. So it's nuance, right? These things tend to be nuanced. But yeah, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin represent the 1990s. That's the Chinese Communist Party's political line in the 1990s. When the global communist movement was in retreat. That's kind of what they represented. All right. So yeah, somebody sent me a super chat about an individual we don't discuss on these live streams. So, I mean, if you bring up certain drama, I'm not going to go there. I'm just not going to go there. So don't bring up certain people and don't bring up certain drama, because I'm not going there. All right. What's my favorite drink and snack from the bodega? Is that a New York City question? Because we have like these little stores in New York City where you can buy sandwiches and you can buy things. I mean, I will buy Diet Coke, unnamed diet beverage there. I generally go to those stores to get things for my wife, right? And she likes to drink Cheetos or drink Cheetos. She likes to drink regular Coke and Cheetos. But yeah, we have those little stores in New York City neighborhoods. They're open all night long. That's what's good about them. So there you go. All righty. And we're constantly told China must stop China from taking Taiwan. Okay. All right. We're constantly told we must stop China from taking Taiwan. But what does that even mean? Isn't it already part of China? Yes, it is part of China. In fact, the name of the country is the Republic of China. What else? The U.S. government says one China, and the government on Taiwan calls itself China. It just has a separate government. So, yes, Taiwan is China. It has always been China. And that the efforts to, arm Taiwan, etc. That is an effort to humiliate China, because the Chinese Communist Party, they have achieved one China, and when China was poor, it was divided, and one China is something that they strive for, and so that's something that the Chinese Communist Party really hangs its hat on. This is what we did. We created one country, one China. So humiliating the Chinese Communist Party and saying, China is divided or whatever, that is something that China has to push back on. And it's a provocation. It's the USA trying to hurt the credibility of the Chinese Communist Party, and they're going to have to respond. And I wish people could understand that China is not being imperialistic or whatever by asserting that, it's not going to allow Taiwan to declare itself to not be China. Right. That China, has to maintain one China that includes Tibet, that includes the Uyghur regions, that includes Hong Kong, that includes Taiwan. Right. And if they don't do that, then their credibility as the ruling institution of China is threatened. So China may have to move on to Taiwan if the United States continues. The mainland of China may have to remove the government on Taiwan and fully reunify with the island. And that is not something that anybody wants. And if the USA wouldn't provoke that, it wouldn't happen. And that's the thing, right? I think that eventually, as economic ties between the mainland and the island of Taiwan grow, eventually Taiwan will just kind of merge back with the mainland. And that's what everybody wants. That would be the ideal solution. But the United States doesn't like China as an economic competitor, and it's trying to tell China what computer chip factories they can have, et cetera. So they're trying to provoke a situation, kind of like with Ukraine, where, after so much waiting, Russia feels, they have to go into Ukraine, right? And they'll create a situation where China, in order to maintain its credibility after all kinds of provocations, they have to go on, they have to reunify with Taiwan. And then the USA will scream from the heavens, oh my God, China's murdering people in Taiwan. And this is their game that they play. And it's very cynical. It's very, very cynical, right? If the USA really cares about the people living on the island of Taiwan, it would not be piling weapons onto the island of Taiwan and condemning, and trying to provoke a military situation there. Same with Ukraine. If you really care about the Ukrainians, you would not provoke a war in their country, right? And this is, using people on the island of Taiwan or using Ukrainians as cannon fodder is not love for them. And this is something our mainstream media never bothers to point out. Have you ever tried Takis? I have not, and I don't know what it is, so I'm Googling it. Takis. They're rolled tortilla chips. Okay. Very good. I have not tried them. I think I've seen them in the stores before. I have not been brave enough to find them. I'm very weird about food. I'm like odd when it comes to food. I watched various clips of the Olympic opening ceremony on YouTube, and it looked disturbing to me. I heard a lot of people speaking up, and I saw clips that looked very disturbing. There was an attack on the Last Supper, from what I understand, from the painting, the Christian painting. There was a lot of weird looking, kind of hypersexualized stuff in the Olympic opening ceremonies. I heard it was just downright weird and uncomfortable. And today my wife and I, we went to the movies, right? We went to the movies and we saw Deadpool Wolverine. And I got to tell you, that was, it's the same kind of feeling. It's just everything is ick nowadays, right? I saw Deadpool Wolverine. What the hell was that? Right? It was just sarcasm mixed in with a lot of blood and gore and a lot of sexual jokes and it's like the whole thing is like a memory or a dream, and they're like going back and forth from the future and all that. Like, what the fuck was that? Right? And that this is like, I feel like they're scrambling our minds. It's not that they're scrambling our minds. This is what rich people, like very, very rich people, find entertaining. Right? The ultra rich people, the rich kids of Williamsburg, right, who would write a movie for fun, right, because they never had to have an actual job in their lives and they want to write a movie. They would write a movie like Deadpool Wolverine, or they would put on, the crazy Paris, opening ceremony, right? This is what rich people like. They like weird shit. Most working people don't, right? But if you're rich and you have all the time in the world to just screw around and be rich and take pleasure in offending people, your tastes get very, very weird very quickly. And that's what we're seeing here. We have this class of people, right, who have never, we have an elite. They talk about this. The Wall Street Journal had an article about how, it used to be that the members of parliament in Britain all served in the military and they would fight the British Empire's wars. Not anymore, right? And that we have an elite at this point that is so disconnected from the masses and disconnected from real suffering. Their understanding of reality is different than ours, okay? It kind of reminds you of Brave New World. If you've ever read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, right? In the movie Brave New World, they have it's like a sci-fi future where everyone's on drugs all the time, where the government is constantly drugging people with this drug called Soma. So they're drugged all the time. They don't ask any questions. And in this Brave New World, the people go to the movies, and the movie that they watch is called 6 Weeks in a Helicopter. And like the movie is about like a woman who's in a helicopter and she's flying over the jungle, and her helicopter crashes. And so her helicopter crashes in the jungle, and then she gets raped by a bunch of monkeys, like literally monkeys, like apes come and rape her. And then her boyfriend comes in another helicopter and lands, and he murders and cuts off the heads of all the monkeys. And it's like supposed to be an example of how in this future society, art has lost any meaning and value, and that people just love sex and violence. And that the hero has memorized Shakespeare, and he goes to see 6 Weeks in a Helicopter in the Brave New World. He's somebody who grew up in in an Indian reservation in like the middle of the jungle or in the middle of the wild, country or whatever. And he comes and joins the Brave New World, and he's horrified because he's memorized Shakespeare. He has a book of Shakespeare. He's memorized it, and he's sitting there and he's watching 6 Weeks in a Helicopter. And he's like, what the hell is this? If you read Brave New World, that's a big part of it. 6 Weeks in a Helicopter, right? Brave New World, chapters 11 and 12. Oh, it's 3 weeks in a helicopter. I'm sorry. 3 weeks in a helicopter. Got it wrong. Brave New World, Brave New World, 3 weeks in a helicopter. Fun story that I heard. Somebody at my high school, I forget who it was. Oh, that's interesting. Somebody at my high school, they knew that our English teacher didn't actually read our book reports. So we read the book Brave New World. And so then we were assigned to read another book and write a book report on it. So he wrote a book report on the book 3 weeks in a Helicopter and turned it in to see if she would notice. And she didn't. And he got, he got all his points for having graded it or whatever. And that was, we used to do things like that in high school. A lot of our teachers didn't give a shit. They didn't give a shit. They would show movies. This is one thing about education in America. It's very unequal, right? I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and, my freshman, God, I hate this woman so much, but my freshman history teacher was the basketball coach, former WNBA player, and she didn't feel like teaching. So she didn't. She would assign us to copy vocabulary words out of our history book, and then we would have a test over them at the end of the week. And, she didn't teach. She didn't feel like she had to teach because, she was a basketball coach and she was former WNBA. So why should she have to actually like teach when she's getting paid to teach? And it was a crime, right? And there was no advanced history class our freshman year. Everyone had her, and she just didn't think she had any obligation to teach. And she showed movies too. In addition to making us just copy words out of the book and giving us study hall and then a test over the study hall every week, she showed movies. And the movies she showed had absolutely nothing to do with what we were. I mean, to learn about the civil rights movement, she has watched Remember the Titans, the football movie. Has nothing to do with the civil rights movement, except that it's about like integration of the football team, but it's a sports movie. She just showed us a sports movie. She was awful. Right. But, I grew up in a small town, and, I see the education people get in New York City. And I see the education that people got in the suburbs, et cetera. And, such people, education in America is very, very unequal. Let me just put it that way. If I'd gone to an inner city school, it's likely the conditions would have been even worse than what I had. Right. It was one thing to, at least no one got it. It was very rare that someone would get arrested at my school. But I know at inner city schools, people get arrested all the time and they have to go through metal detectors. So what am I complaining about? Right. It could always be worse. Right. So I'm not saying I had the worst education in the world, because I didn't. Right. But I'm just telling you, education in America is very, 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 very unequal. And, the amount of teachers I had who showed movies, the amount of teachers I had who did not teach, the amount of, I don't know. I tell this story. My 6th grade teacher, she taught us that the Big Bang Theory was about a meteor hitting the earth and killing the dinosaurs. And that's what she believed. I guess when that meteor hit the earth, it made a really big bang. But she told us that over and over and over again. That the Big Bang Theory was about a meteorite hitting the earth and killing the dinosaurs. And I just, she was teaching 6th grade. She went on to become a principal. So there you go. I don't know. She also, we were learning about different tenses or whatever. There's superlative, right? And she pronounced it superlative. And then this girl in the front row raised her hand and said, "But there's no R. Why is it superlative? There's no R." And she said, "We'll just say it that way." I love that. This is American education. American education is an embarrassment. We're supposed to be the richest country in the world. And, there you go. All right, y'all. Okay. If nobody has any more questions, right? No one has any more questions. I will probably end this stream. I thank you all for being here. Let me just say, I don't know what's going to happen with this. This situation with the Kamala Harris book is very strange. It's a very strange situation. I did not see this coming. I thought what would happen was that my book got a slight uptick in sales. That's what I thought was going to happen. I thought, okay, I wrote an obscure book about Kamala Harris. I sold a few hundred copies. And now she's the nominee for president, so I'll see a slight uptick in sales. And then they banned it from Amazon, and then a lot of prominent people started defending me, and it became kind of a symbol of how Amazon is rigging the elections. And we've got a plan about what our next move is, and thousands of people are reading the book right now, and every 2 minutes I seem to sell one, and this is getting wild. I don't know how this ends. Honestly, I really don't know. What comes next. I'm trying not to catastrophize. I'm trying to just focus on, hey, things are good, and I know that I'm motivated. I have good intentions and a good motivation, and that there's a group of people that really appreciate what I do, and that's you. That's you, right? You are the group of people that really appreciate what I do. Anytime, Terry, anytime. Just I'll come on your show anytime. On your channel it is. And so I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, and we'll see what happens next. And, we've got a plan you'll be hearing about very soon about our next move. We'll play the next card. Not going to reveal it on here. But you'll hear about it soon enough. And we don't back down. We don't back down. We don't surrender. And dare to struggle, dare to win. Thanks, everybody. And I'm going to put on the closing music. But I'll be back soon.
New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.